The UN resolution, Security Council Resolution 2803, references a board of peace for Gaza. That's where we see it becoming immediately operative, and it needs to be, in our view, it's better to be designed in that way for the immediate needs there. There are many other needs around the world, first point. Second point, it needs to coincide with the immediate full flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza. We are still not where we need to be. Conditions still are horrific. So that needs to come alongside. We think there's aspects of the governance and the decision-making process that could be improved. But we will work with others, obviously work with the United States, because we will do anything that we can to improve the situation, the horrific situation there, and to move onto a path to a true two-state solution.
Well, I think there's a long list of people nominated for the Board of Peace, and I think some of the details are still being determined. And for $1 billion, you get a permanent seat. I saw over the weekend. I've not dug into the details of that. It's not within our purview. It's an administration project.
Oh, this is a great location. It all begins. See, I'm a real estate person at heart, and it's all about location. And I said, look at this location on the sea. Look at this beautiful piece of property, what it could be for so many people. It'll be so great. People that are living so poorly are going to be living so well. But it all began with a location. That's the vision. Then look out on the waters, and very few places are like it.
A new model of power just debuted on the world stage, not through diplomacy, not through law, but through a boardroom. And if this becomes normal, the next conflict won't be resolved. It'll be managed. North America and the world just watched a new form of authority emerge in real time. And it didn't happen at the United Nations. It happened at Davos. A board of peace for Gaza was unveiled like a corporate redevelopment pitch. Pay to enter seats, an indefinite chair with veto power, and a $25 billion master plan presented as if a devastated territory were a portfolio waiting for investors. This isn't diplomacy. This is governance rewritten in the language of capital. And if Gaza becomes the test case, the precedent won't stay in Gaza. So let's slow this down and look at what actually happened in Davos. Not the branding, not the press releases, but the operating system underneath. Because once you see the structure, the whole project stops looking like peacebuilding and starts looking like a prototype. The Davos presentation wasn't just a redevelopment pitch. It was a live demonstration of a new governing logic, one where post-war territories are treated less like political communities and more like distressed assets waiting for restructuring. The language was polished, the branding was humanitarian, but the architecture underneath was unmistakably corporate. Seats you buy, authority you centralize, and a future you design from the outside in. And that's the tell. Because when a place is rebuilt without the people who live there at the center of decision-making, you're not restoring sovereignty, you're reallocating it. You're shifting power from public institutions to a boardroom model where influence is proportional to capital, not legitimacy. This is why the Board of Peace matters far beyond Gaza. It signals that the world's most powerful actors are no longer waiting for multilateral consensus. They're building parallel structures, faster, more flexible, and far less accountable. And once a model like this is normalized in one crisis, it becomes a template for the next. The most revealing part of the Davos model isn't the branding, it's the buy-in. A governance structure where states contribute for a seat isn't innovation, it's monetized legitimacy. It turns political representation into a transaction, and it quietly rewrites the rules of who gets to decide the future of a people who never asked for this board in the first place. And once representation has a price tag, everything downstream changes. Influence stops being tied to responsibility. Decision-making stops being tied to accountability. And the people living in the territory stop being political agents and become stakeholders in name only, the kind you consult, not the kind you empower. This is why the pay-to-enter model matters. It's not a detail, it's the operating principle. Because if you can buy your way into shaping Gaza's future, you can buy your way into shaping any post-conflict zone. And if you can buy your way in, you can also buy your way out. out of obligations, out of scrutiny, out of the messy work of justice. This is the quiet shift Davos revealed. Peace as a product, governance as a service, sovereignty as a subscription. If the buy-in seats reveal the transactional nature of the board, the indefinite chairmanship with veto power exposes its hierarchy. This isn't multilateralism streamlined, it's authority consolidated. A single chair with the ability to override the rest of the board isn't a facilitator, it's a sovereign in disguise. And the permanence matters. Indefinite leadership means the structure is designed to outlast the crisis. It's not a temporary coordination mechanism, it's an institution. One that can shape reconstruction, security, borders, contracts, and political outcomes long after the rubble is cleared. This is how governance becomes control. Not through annexation, not through declarations, but through administrative permanence. A veto is not a tool of consensus. It's a tool of dominance. It ensures that no matter how many states participate, one actor or one bloc holds the final word. And once you build a system where one seat can overrule the rest, you've created a hierarchy that mirrors the very power imbalances the UN was designed to prevent. Except now, the hierarchy isn't even pretending to be democratic. It's openly managerial. This is why the Davos model is so dangerous. It doesn't just centralize power. It normalizes the idea that post-war futures can be shaped by whoever can afford a seat and whoever controls the veto. And once that logic is accepted in Gaza, it becomes exportable to any region where powerful states decide the UN is too slow, too constrained, or too accountable. The redevelopment pitch at Davos wasn't just tone-deaf, it was revealing. Because the moment Gaza was described through the language of corridors, zones, and potential, the political reality was replaced with a market reality. A place under siege became a site. A displaced population became a workforce. A shattered city became a canvas. This is the quiet violence of redevelopment logic. It reframes a people's trauma as an opportunity. It turns destruction into a business model. And it invites the world to see Gaza not as a political community with rights, but as a project with returns. A $25 billion plan is not humanitarian aid. It's an economy. And economies have winners and owners. Reconstruction at this scale creates contracts, monopolies, security arrangements, land use decisions, procurement pipelines, and long-term control over who gets to build, who gets to profit, and who gets to stay. Once you control zoning, you control the future. Once you control contracts, you control the landscape. Once you control access, you control sovereignty. This is why the redevelopment language matters. It's not a neutral vocabulary. It's a worldview, one where the people of Gaza are not the authors of their future, but the subjects of someone else's blueprint. And when a blueprint is drawn without the people who live there, the result may be infrastructure, but it won't be liberation. The easiest way to sell a board of peace is to frame it as a solution to UN paralysis. But that framing hides the real story. The UN didn't collapse on its own. It was pushed. Not on paper, in practice. For years, powerful states have treated international law as optional. Resolutions were vetoed into irrelevance. Court rulings were ignored when inconvenient. Humanitarian norms were enforced selectively, depending on who the violator was and who the victim was. And every time the rules were bent, every time enforcement depended on geopolitics instead of principle, the message was absorbed by the system. The UN is only as strong as the powerful allow it to be. That's the vacuum the Davos model steps into, not a vacuum of ideas, a vacuum of enforcement, a vacuum created by the very states now proposing alternatives. This is the danger. Once you normalize a parallel peace structure, one where power buys entry, capital buys influence, and the UN becomes a decorative partner, you're not just replacing a process. You're replacing a principle. Today it's Gaza. Tomorrow it's any territory where the rules are inconvenient, the timeline is tight, or the interests are too large to leave to multilateral debate. And once the world accepts that peace can be outsourced to a boardroom, The entire post-war order built after 1945 starts to look optional. If the Board of Peace feels familiar, it's because the logic behind it already shapes the world. Different powers use different tools, but the worldview is the same. There are places where the rules apply, and places where they bend. Russia frames Eastern Europe as its historical sphere of influence, a zone where its security concerns override the sovereignty of its neighbors. China frames Taiwan as an internal matter, a place where international norms are dismissed as interference. And the United States frames the Western Hemisphere as its strategic backyard, a region where pressure, sanctions, and recognition politics are justified as stability measures. Different rhetoric, different justifications, same architecture. Each power claims exceptional rights in the spaces it considers vital. Each power insists that its actions are defensive, stabilizing, or humanitarian. And each power expects the world to accept that some borders are sacred while others are negotiable. This is why the Davos model fits so neatly into the moment. It doesn't challenge the global order, it reflects it. A board that can override local sovereignty, manage reconstruction, and shape political outcomes from the outside isn't a break from the system, it's the system distilled. It's the logic of spheres of influence, but privatized. It's the logic of great power exceptionalism, but branded as development. And this is where the hypocrisy becomes unavoidable. The same governments that defend sovereignty in Ukraine and Taiwan are now entertaining a governance structure for Gaza that sidelines the very principle they claim to protect. The same actors who warn against coercion abroad are comfortable using economic and administrative coercion when it aligns with their interests. This isn't contradiction. It's consistency, the consistency of a world where power decides when rules matter. And the Davos board is simply the newest expression of that logic, a structure that doesn't need to annex territory to control it, doesn't need to break the rules to bypass them, and doesn't need legitimacy when it can purchase participation. For all the talk of innovation, coordination, and fast-track peace, the most striking part of the Davos model is who isn't in the room. Because a governance structure built about Gaza is being designed without Gaza. Not without its geography, without its people. And that absence isn't a technical oversight. It's the logic of the model. When Palestinians appear in the plan, they appear as beneficiaries, labor to be trained, a population to be stabilized, a community to be integrated into someone else's vision, but never as political agents, never as authors of their own future, never as the sovereign voice at the center of reconstruction. This is the quiet erasure embedded in the boardroom approach. It treats Palestinians as a demographic to be managed rather than a people with rights. It replaces self-determination with consultation. It replaces political agency with stakeholder engagement. It replaces liberation with logistics. And once you remove the people from the decision-making structure, everything else becomes easier to justify. The buy-in seats, the veto chair, the redevelopment blueprint, the sidelining of the UN, the external control of borders, contracts, and security. Because without Palestinian political agency, the board doesn't have to negotiate with a sovereign people. It only has to manage a territory. This is why the Davos model is not just a governance experiment. It's a political act, one that redefines who counts as a decision maker and who becomes the subject of decisions. And the cost of that shift is not abstract. It's lived. It's daily. It's borne by the people who have already endured siege, displacement, and destruction, now asked to accept a future designed in rooms they cannot enter. A system that produces infrastructure without justice is not peace. It's administration. What happened at Davos isn't a one-off experiment. It's a prototype, a model designed to travel. Because once you prove that a devastated territory can be governed through a boardroom, funded through buy-in seats, and rebuilt through external blueprints, you've created a template that can be exported anywhere the rules are inconvenient. And the world is full of places where the rules are inconvenient. Any region caught between great power interests, any territory emerging from conflict, any population too politically weak to resist external management, any crisis where urgency can be used to bypass accountability. That's the danger. Not that Gaza becomes an exception, but that Gaza becomes the example. A model like this spreads because it solves problems for the powerful. It bypasses slow, multilateral processes. It concentrates authority without requiring legitimacy. It turns reconstruction into a market. It reframes sovereignty as something flexible, negotiable, and purchasable. And once the world accepts that peace can be administered like a portfolio, the entire post-war order built on self-determination starts to erode. Not through dramatic declarations, through quiet normalization. This is how global systems change, not with treaties, but with precedents, not with speeches, but with structures, not with wars, but with the governance models built after them. And the Davos model is a structure waiting for replication. Today, it's Gaza. Tomorrow, it's wherever the next crisis creates an opening. What happened at Davos wasn't a conference moment. It was a line moving quietly, confidently, and in full view of the world. A new model of power was introduced, not as a theory, not as a proposal, but as a working prototype. A model where sovereignty is flexible, representation is purchasable, and reconstruction is a market shaped by those who can afford to participate. And the most important part is this: no one stopped it. No one said the quiet part out loud. No one challenged the idea that a devastated population could be governed through a boardroom. That silence is the signal. Because global systems don't collapse with explosions. They erode through normalization. They shift when new structures appear and no one pushes back. They change when the powerful discover a tool that works for them and keep using it. The Board of Peace is not the future of Gaza. It's the future of crisis governance if the world lets it stand. A world where the UN becomes a partner instead of an authority, reconstruction becomes an investment strategy, sovereignty becomes negotiable, and the people most affected become the least empowered. This is the crossroads, not for Gaza alone, for the entire international system. Because if this model spreads, the next conflict won't be resolved through law, diplomacy, or collective will. It will be managed, administered, optimized, and the people living through it will inherit a future designed in rooms they never entered. That's the story Davos revealed. Not a plan, a precedent. Today, it's Gaza. Tomorrow, it can be any territory where powerful actors want the outcome but don't want the constraints. A board, a fund, a consortium, a stabilization authority, a transition council, always framed as humanitarian urgency, always structured as elite control. What's being sold as a board of peace is starting to look less like diplomacy and more like $1 billion private power structure dressed up as global governance. What we're watching is the logical outcome of years of powerful states undermining the UN, ignoring courts, and treating international law as optional. So what do we watch next? Watch whether this board claims legal mandate or operates by political muscle. Watch whether its charter language ties Gaza to enforceable rights or treats Gaza like a redevelopment zone. Watch who controls procurement and security, because that's where sovereignty lives in practice. Watch whether European governments who worry publicly actually resist materially or simply issue statements while the machinery moves forward. Watch whether the UN is invited as a partner after the decisions are made or as an authority before the decisions are made. That difference is everything. And watch the composition of the coalition, because coalitions don't just reveal preferences, they reveal the future governance model being normalized. Because if Gaza becomes the test case for privatized geopolitics, then we're not watching a peace process. We're watching the next stage of global power. Governance as a subscription service where the wealthy buy seats, the powerful hold vetoes, and the people who live on the land are treated like stakeholders in a project they never approved. If global governance can be replaced by a pay-to-enter board with veto power and a redevelopment plan, what is left of international law besides a slogan? This is Liberation Lens. We report the news, then we expose the structure underneath it. And we don't ask you to accept a narrative. We ask you to interrogate who benefits from it. See you in the next.